Nothing changes if you give up. And it's like the example I mentioned early on. It's darkest before the dawn kind of thing. And
but here's the thing, Allie. I want to help you, but people are going to hear you say they've given up. They haven't given up. They've given up on electoral politics, and they feel dismissed when candidates tell them that if you aren't supporting my candidacy, you are giving up. Because they're not giving up. They're saying, I see what you're asking me to do. I was on board with that train. I tried it, and all the people that I got elected failed me.
You're like us. You're grassroots trying to raise your money.
Yeah.
And it's ridiculous. Yeah. And it's just so frustrating to me that the American people are being led into the way that they think.
You know, just a word of advice, people feel insulted when they're being told, just because I'm not going to support an electoral strategy, I'm giving up on broad progress, because the people who listen to this show are still very engaged. I am so glad to be joined today by Reverend Wendy Hamilton, who is running for Congress in the great district of Washington, D.C. Welcome, right. Reverend.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
And also Allie Dalsimer, who's running in Virginia's 11th district. Welcome, Allie.
Thank you so much, Briahna. I'm super excited to be here.
All right. So people who listen to this show are going to have one question top of mind, because it's a question that many on the left have been wrestling with probably since the beginning of last year, which is, to what extent and why should they still be engaged in electoralism when so many people feel like, despite working really hard to get so many folks, good progressive folks, elected to Congress in the last cycle, there have been little to no returns on those kinds of investments? Have you each been engaging with that question at all, or dealing with that question from your constituents at all, your prospective constituents?
Absolutely. I can speak here in D.C. that there's just a sense of hopelessness, right? There's this sense of disconnectedness that I was hearing all over the city as I was engaging residents. Like, what's the point? Like, we've done this. I've voted this many times, and we still have not seen anything tangible happening in our lives. And that's real. And so I had to validate that, but also suggest that the only way that we can actually continue to press toward making that change is send better qualified people, the folks who are actually committed to doing it, and pushing forward toward continuing to challenge the system. Because I'd like to think that even though we haven't necessarily gotten the folks in there that we wanted and gotten away, we've chipped away, little by little, race by race, election by election. And I just have to hope that continuing to do that, continuing to press our way, there will be a breakthrough.
I'd like to answer that too as well, because I've definitely experienced a great number of people who have that frustration. Mm-hmm. They're feeling disappointed about what's happening. I actually spoke with one woman on the phone. I was during call time, and she's, a big supporter of the squad of progressive candidates. And she was like, I'm done. I'm moving to the south of France. We're done. And I was like, well, that's great. So glad you can do that.
Yeah.
The rest of us maybe can't afford to do that. So we're stuck here in this system. And, the thing that I like to point out, as you know, and maybe your listeners do or don't know about me, but I spent 30 years working in the natural resources field. And one of the big issues that we deal with there is endangered species. And for those who don't know, an endangered species is a plant or animal that is in such dire straits that it's at risk of going extinct and not being here anymore. And that's important for a number of reasons. The timeline, the time horizon to recover a species is anywhere from 30 to 70 years. It took a long time for us to decimate some of these things. And I tell people, when you're looking at some of what's going on with the squad and not maybe being happy about what's going on, you're looking at, it's been since 1980, Reagan, right? So you're looking at 40 years of people basically undermining the true democratic system, little d, and corporations taking over and resulting in Citizens United and this big push to we all know what's going on. You can't turn it around since 2018. It's going to take a while. And I would argue that we've already made some progress. There has been progress. We are now talking about getting rid and abolishing the death penalty. We're talking about legalizing marijuana. We are talking about universal health care. That was not anything anyone was even talking about 10 years ago. So change is hard. People are by nature resistant to change, but we have to keep pushing and we have to keep going. And the way we're going to achieve success is by getting people who are not taking corporate PAC or dark monies, like the grassroots candidates that are running now, and getting more of those folks in Congress. Because if we can get a preponderance in, we'll start to see an acceleration of that change and pushing forward. Because, people, and I don't mean to call anybody out, but people like Dianne Feinstein, she's like almost 90. Maybe she was progressive in the 70s or 80s. That could have been. But, progress is a continual change. So we need to change the makeup. And I think people don't need always darkest right before the light, right? We've got to push through.
So here's the concern. Here's the pushback. The pushback is, you mentioned someone like Dianne Feinstein, someone else might say Nancy Pelosi. And some folks are old enough to remember and have the kind of historical context to remember that Nancy Pelosi herself was heralded as this record-setting young woman in Congress who thought it was heralding a Medicare for all and talking about a lot of the issues that you enumerated 30 years ago. But because of the corrupting influence of Congress, because of maybe her own just sheer personality and interests and conservative nature, has shifted very far from whatever progressive roots might once have existed, and is now perceived by many on the left to be a primary obstacle to change. And so when people have worked very hard to get progressives like the squad members in office, and there were opportunities to, even with their small number, because of the narrow margins in the House, exert a great deal of control with the power that they did have, right? Not looking to 20, 30 years from now when we have even more progressives in Congress, but just in the context of last year's congressional cycle, had the power to say, prevent Nancy Pelosi from being Speaker of the House or hold her over the barrel in exchange for any number of concessions. And they chose not to do that when there have been so many votes that have been so narrow that but for progressives, they couldn't have increased Capitol Police funding. But for progressives, they couldn't have voted to increase funding to the Iron Dome. But for progressives. That's what causes people to believe that electing more progressives won't do anything because the system changes progressives. The progressives don't change the system. What do you say to that?
I think that's a really valid point and a really fair point. And I think that I've seen that as well. I've seen it more with some people than others. For example, I don't want to call out names. There are certain people who have been heralded as leaders of the progressive movement who have, in my opinion as well, not held up those values. But there are others like Cori Bush, who I will call out and say, she's standing up. And the votes when she was first in, those early on, those were a little disappointment. And I have not spoken with her about this. But I would guess that she probably feels a little bit manipulated in how that whole situation happened. And we have seen her stand up, like when she went to the Capitol steps. Nobody else was there until she was there. And then they kind of came around for photo ops, but she was there the whole 5 days. So I would say that people have a very valid point. And it is definitely hard, especially when you have these young people going in, they're in their 20s or maybe early 30s, and they're facing people who have been doing this political game for 50 years. I get it. But what's the alternative? Give up and let corporations rule the world? I think we need to fight back, and we need an inside-outside approach. We need activists to hold our representatives' feet to the fire and push them in a direction that benefits people.
So you mentioned activists and inside and outside approach. And I think that what people would say when you ask what's the alternative would be to say that they would support the outside approach, at least when it comes to their dollars. I think a lot of folks, of course, would prefer the progressive candidate over the centrist candidate to win in any given race. And if they lived in those districts, they would happily vote for the progressive candidate. But the challenge that I've observed, and we were all at a fundraising event for a number of Black women progressive candidates from across the country last night, the challenge that I'm observing is there's a lack of enthusiasm for fundraising support,
right?
When contrasted with what people were willing to give in the context of a Bernie media cycle and the 2018 midterm cycle where progressives really had their moment. And that seems to me to be directly related to people's frustrations that they were giving their last $7.
Right.
And the people they gave those $7 to have been, to your point, cowed by the system. And I don't think anybody really feels that's like a value judgment. The system is difficult to stand up against, you know? So I guess my question then to you is, how do you see yourself negotiating that process? What do you see as the, bulwark that's going to keep you from succumbing in the way that so many very well-meaning and good people like Cori Bush, I believe, have felt forced into taking positions or taking votes or silencing themselves on issues in a way they might not have anticipated before they got into Congress? Let's start with you, Reverend.
I think it has to do with, first and foremost, discerning people's behavior. Like, human behavior is hard to discern, right? People can tell you what they are going to do and what they're going to stand for. And like you just pointed out, though, finding themselves up against the system, suddenly what they said seems to go away. And that's the nature of human behavior. Unfortunately, it's not good or bad, it just is. So what I suggest is that the persons who are running have to be true to themselves about what they're willing to stand up for and what they're willing to fight for before they put their name into the hat to run. So for me, I can only speak for myself that I don't believe my constitution, my personal constitution, is strong enough to not be compromised. I answer to a higher authority, if you will. And so for me, it's not about going in and completely going back on what I'm running on and what I say I'm going to stand for, because that's integrity. You understand what I'm saying? And so it's not just about, well, she voted for this group versus that group. No, she compromised her integrity. And that's not something I'm willing to do. And so that's all I can put forward and trust that people will believe that. But at the end of the day, reminding people of their power, that if the folks aren't doing, I get that, it can be frustrating, but until we can get the people in here who can maintain their integrity in the face of this corporate pressure, then we're going to have to keep flooding the system. I mean, I know that it can be draining and you just want to go away, but I don't know that that's going to help. We just have to hold people accountable. And if they go in there and they fold, or they for some of the older people who are in there, you're talking about the Pelosi's of the world and the Feinsteins of the world. For some of these folks, somewhere along the line, this position, this role becomes their identity, right? And now they feel like, if I'm not associated with, if I don't become this public figurehead that people respect and look up to, then who am I? And so that's what causes them to decide that they want to stay until they are voted out. But they don't seem to be getting voted out. So I want to put the power back in the people's hands on this question.
So I think we all have a sense of what's motivating someone like a Dianne Feinstein or Nancy Pelosi to not advocate for progressive ideals. I think it's a tougher question when we have some of these newer people who a lot of us either continue to have faith in or at one point in recent history had a great deal of faith in. I don't know if you've been following what has been happening with Jamal Bowman and the question of whether or not DSA should kick him out over some of his votes pertaining to Israel funding in BDS.
Okay.
I'm going to read a little clip from this Nation article about it for just to catch people up in case they don't know. He writes, last week, for perhaps the first time, we saw a fraying in this partnership between DSA and progressives in Congress. Select chapters of DSA and a number of socialist leaders called for the expulsion of Representative Jamal Bowman from the organization. Bowman, a New York Democrat and DSA member who defeated Eliot Engel in 2020, ran afoul of these chapters for taking a recent trip to Israel and meeting with the new right-wing prime minister. He also drew the ire of DSA members for voting to fund Israel's Iron Dome defense system and refusing to back the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel. Quote, I think we have to hold our elected officials to a higher standard, said Jen Edwards, the co-chair of Madison area DSA in Wisconsin. One of our very closely held principles is solidarity with Palestine and support of BDS. The decision of Jamal Bowman to vote multiple times for funding for the Israeli military, including the Iron Dome vote and his recent visit to Israel and meeting with the parliament of Israel, is directly in conflict with those principles. Other chapters disagreed, and more recently, there was basically a list that was promulgated with all of these names of folks who supported Jamal Bowman coming in, and the defecting chapters were defecting groups who were critical of Jamal were expelled instead, or can't. I think those working groups were shut down instead. And so this is the kind of thing I would say to you, and this question of, how do you create accountability? How do you make sure the electeds that you send are accountable would be to have a kind of partnership with organizations like DSA or the Poor People's Campaign or, maybe Working Families Party or Socialist Alternative, whatever it is, that can hold its membership accountable. But what you're seeing in this instance is that the members, the org seem to be accountable to the electeds rather than the other way around. And I wonder what you make of the situation and what your relationship might be with similar sorts of organizations when we're talking about these questions of accountability.
So I'd like to go back and address the other question as well, if that's cool.
Sure.
So you had asked about sort of the inside-outside approach and funding. These groups want to fund only the outside, the activism side of it. And I would argue that until we get campaign finance reform, all the activism in the world isn't going to change anything, because I don't know if you were around in the 80s in DC when we had the World Bank protests and the IMF protests and all this other stuff, and nothing fundamentally changed because we didn't have anybody in Congress willing to make those changes. So I would, for those who say I'm only going to support one half of this coin, I would argue you have to support both halves. So I would just throw that out there, because all the activism in the world isn't going to move Joe Manchin to do anything. Do you know what I mean?
Well, what will move Joe Manchin to do anything?
Getting primaried by someone who is electable. What's that guy's name? He's the ex-army guy. It'll come to me later.
Richard Ojeda.
Ojeda, yeah, somebody like that.
Richard Ojeda.
Yeah. I mean, he's someone who might have might have had a chance because of just the nature of West Virginia politics, I think. But anyway, I don't want to belabor that point, but I would argue that, and then I would also agree with Reverend Wendy about, you have to make sure that, and this goes into the Jamal Bowman question, right? Like, you have to make sure you're holding your representatives accountable. And I think calling him out for something like that is worthwhile. Having said that, I'm not sure he's ever come out with a different position prior to being elected. So at least I haven't seen it. Maybe you have. I didn't, look into his campaign background a whole lot. I mean, I certainly watched his run. And I think what we have to be careful of in the entire change movement arena is the circular firing squad. And I personally believe Jamal Bowman is wrong on this issue. I think we have to stand up for Palestinian and human rights everywhere. I do not understand why doing BDS for Russia is what we all need to be doing, but doing it for Israel is somehow anti-Semitic. I don't, the thought that, well, I mean, we can get into a whole discussion about how media influences the entire American populace thinking, and how that's a whole corrupt system. But I think we have to be careful of trying to only support the perfect candidate, because all candidates are at their essence human beings, and we're not all going to be perfect on every issue. And I think we need to try and make sure that we're putting forward candidates who can move the dial in substantive ways, and then maybe work to change those positions where they're not good. And I think if DSA calls out Jamal Bowman on this, they should try to talk with him and educate him about this particular position, because,
well, it doesn't seem like that's
working.
What it feels like, no, it feels like there's not an interest in it, right? It feels like there's an interest in, look, I'm a DSA member, but the perception, many people who are also DSA members are frustrated because of this push and pull. It does feel like the organization got a huge amount of clout, for lack of a better word, from the rise of Bernie in 2016 and then the subsequent wave in 2018. And the fact of AOC in particular kind of openly identifying as a DSA candidate caused a lot of people to want to sign up. I signed up in 2018 during that exciting spring primary. And as a consequence, I think that in some ways, counterintuitively, the candidate put the org on the map in terms of its enormous exponential growth that happened at that time. Obviously, it's been pre-existing. And therefore, there does seem to be this unwillingness to decouple from the figureheads that created the enrollment boost and its national prominence and all of those other kinds of things. And I'm not saying that, I don't mean that as an insult. I understand the motives there, and they're not entirely crazy. I mean, I'm sure they're able to do important things with the money they're able to bring in now because of the prominence of these individuals. But to what end? And I think a little bit of transparency there would be helpful. But the reason I bring it up is not because of a conversation about DSA in particular, but because of this question of accountability. When I've had Shama Sawant, a Seattle City Councilwoman, on the show, she has talked about how having accountability to organization and having the organization basically vet, it's the org that's deciding how to vote and what the positions are going to be on various things, not just an individual actor, is part of what has kept her grounded. And absent those kinds of relationships, I think it's difficult to ask people not just to support in terms of their vote an inside strategy, which again, I think that most people are more than happy to do. I mean, if you're living in Cleveland and you obviously will go ahead and cast your ballot for Nina Turner over Shontel Brown. That's a no-brainer. The question is, especially given that we're dealing with so many working class, low-income people whose policies, who progressive policies are targeting and benefiting, are they going to give an hour's wage in one of these classic Bernie-style $7 donations, or are they going to give a day's wage to candidates when they feel like that money hasn't been well spent in the past? And I think that's the fundamental issue, because as hard as it is with money in politics and electoral reform, the situation seems to me to be getting worse for progressives as progressives feel like the base is getting ignored.
I feel like it also has a lot to do, Briahna, with, at the end of the day, managing our expectations around the message. And when I say that sometimes in a case like what you just described, the overall message and mission can get usurped by the messenger or by the perceived connections that the people that the message might be connected to. And so I think it falls upon the leadership of the particular party to keep people reminded about what progress looks like. What is it that we want to see achieved? If, like Alex said, we're all human. So we may not be the perfect candidate, but which candidate is leading us toward the outcomes that we want to see? Who is sticking and aligning as closely to our message as we want them to? And if they're not, then we need to seek that out and make sure that I think the leadership of the party itself, of working families, poor people's, whatever that is, making sure that the membership is tied to the message and not necessarily the messenger. Does that make sense? It may be harder to do, but that's how we begin to, because you also see, I'm thinking about third parties, right? A lot of people are exploring that these days, and that the third parties that are coming on board are saying, let's move away from, one direction or other. What are our primary goals? What are our primary, what policies do we want to see supported? What policies do we want to see introduced? I don't care who's introducing them. But at the end of the day, our goal is to be able to say it was because of our membership and our message with these specific candidates who adopted them, that the message of our party is now moving forward. And so I think there's a balance. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I got to tell you, last night we were asked, in an ideal world, what would you like to see? I'd like to see us do away with the party system. I think it's ridiculous. I think we need to run on, these are our policies, whatever. I'm running as a Democrat because this district is a D+32. No one but a Democrat is going to win. Right. That's just a reality. And if we didn't have a party system, that would be great. But we do, so we work within it. I would like to ask, are you guys familiar with case studies, People's Gauntlet? Because case study, so he's got these candidates going through, and his concept is, let's let these candidates answer all these questions. I'm not going to tell them what to say. I'm going to say, you tell me what you think. And then people can go, they can listen to these gauntlets. They're each in little 10-minute sections, and they can decide. Because those questions, he asks a lot of questions. And there were some things that I got to tell you, I have had this huge learning curve over the last year since I've been running, because there are some issues that are not really important to people of my district. It's just a reality. But they're huge, and they're important for, one of the questions I was asked was about Native American treaty rights. And I was like, I don't know what the treaties specifically related to, like, where my district is. I was familiar with the Powhatan Indians and that kind of stuff. And so I was able to learn about that a little bit. But the gauntlets, I think candidates should go through those gauntlets, and then people can go to those, listen for themselves, find out where people stand. If Jamal Bowman had done it, everybody would have known that he was on the side of Israel in this situation. They would have known that up front. And I think that that's a really good way for people to decide, do I want to support this candidate? And in terms of your question, are they going to put their $7 towards it? People don't make a living wage in this country. And if you're making $9.50, $7.50, $11 an hour, I don't know. You really want to do that? Because that's the equivalent of somebody who's on Wall Street making $6 million, putting like several $1,000s in. It's a big chunk, and I don't know. And I would not tell someone that they should do that if they're trying to feed their families and pay their rent, because I feel like, I was talking with someone, like, I'm kind of the climate candidate, right? Like, because of my background. And I was talking with someone one time, and they're like, yeah, I mean, I get climate change, but like, I don't care. And my sort of initial was like, how can you not care? Like, literally, existential threat means a threat to our lives. Like, we're going to die, right? Don't look up. But then in the very next instant, I was like, you know what? Here's someone who is, and we'd had a conversation. Here's someone who's a single mom who's struggling to pay the rent, who's working 2 jobs. And I'm like, there's no reason that this woman should care. That's why I'm here. I can care about this, because she needs to focus on her immediate needs. How do I feed my kids? How do I make sure I pay my rent? And so I feel like those of us who are able to step forth and step up, who can run for office, who can join a group, who can do whatever it is they can do. If everybody can do whatever they can do, then we all need to be watching out for each other. And I wouldn't ask someone who can't afford the $7 to put that $7 there. But there are a lot of people who can and should be doing more.
Yeah, I mean, last night it's difficult for me, right? Because I'm in this position. I hear the frustrations from everybody, and they frankly resonate with me, and I agree with them. But then I'll experience something like the panel last night, or talking to each of you, and I'll think, well, these people are working so hard. They're trying so hard. They are so obviously better than the alternative. And there are some tangible things that you can do when you're in, although it takes you being oftentimes adversarial with your own party, which is why I think so many people are more trustful of folks who are running independently of the Democratic Party, just because that seems to be already like a calling card that says, I'm not going to bend the knee and do what Nancy Pelosi says when she screams at me on the House floor. I'm obviously referencing that instance where AOC ended up in tears because of whatever Nancy Pelosi says to her. And it says, being outside of the party says to some folks, no matter what, Nancy Pelosi can't step to me. There's already a presumption, a very open presumption that we're voting as a bloc separate and apart from the Democratic Party's interests. But I appreciate you, I guess what I'm just trying to say is I am genuinely torn, and I'm not trying to make you each go through this gauntlet of my own. Although I do think that's part and parcel of how you get people to reinvest. I don't think ignoring the issue gets people to change their mind. I think getting candidates to acknowledge and to give some accounting for how they think they're going to be able to operate differently, then I think the perfectly well-intentioned progressives that have already been elected is really important to that end. I want to give each of you a chance, though, to talk about your actual races, what you're up against and what you stand for. So let's start with you, Reverend Wendy. Tell us about your district and what you're up against.
Well, I'm just that last description, though, that you just talked about is just still resonating with me, because I'm putting myself in that position, right? Okay, let's say I've beat this 32-year incumbent that I am currently running against, and I'm standing on the floor, and there's a vote being taken that I said and I promised and I've told everybody that when it comes to that vote, I shall not be moved. This is going to be my position on it. And then having the weight of the House chamber and the leadership staring down at me. And, I can't imagine what that pressure can and must be like. But again, at the end of the day, I would like to believe, I'm not perfect, but I would like to believe that my integrity would hold and that I would still stand for who and what I said I was going up there to stand for and to do and to be. That is my plan. That is my goal. However, if for some reason something happened and I don't know, I had an out of body experience and voted another way, what I won't do is hide on the hill and not come out into the district and allow myself to be held accountable by the people who voted me in there. And that is what I'm up against right now. I am running in Washington, D.C. for delegate to Congress in the United States House of Representatives. Now, first and foremost, most might say, well, I didn't know that's a non-voting seat. Yes, it is non-voting for now. That's why D.C. statehood is a fight that I will continue. And speaking of Joe Manchin, I'm going to go talk to Joe Manchin. All kinds of other people are, writing him letters of concern. And I'm posting up in his office. Like, I need to holler at you for a minute because you're holding up too much stuff. But anyway, and until I get that opportunity to have my face-to-face conversation with Joe, I am going to use my voice. I may not be able to vote, but I can use my voice. I can write legislation. I can sit on committees. I can be influential in a way that I feel is and will be meaningful for Washington, D.C. until we become the 51st state, the Douglas Commonwealth. And so that is what I'm running for in this moment. I'm not taking corporate PAC money. We are a completely people power campaign. I'm a social justice advocate. I'm a minister. I'm a mother. I'm a new grandmother. I'm a regular everyday person. The type of people that we say we want in these offices. I'm not a politician. I've worked with politicians. I was a spiritual and cultural outreach director for the Andrew Yang presidential campaign in 2020. So I've got some political chops. I've worked on the Hill. It's not that. I'm not coming from that space, though. I'm bringing that experience with me, but I'm running as a regular, everyday woman who has been a single mother, who has experienced homelessness. I'm not running to just represent people. I am people. And that's what I'm bringing to offer. And that's who I would like to believe that I would continue to be in my role as delegate to the United States Congress. As I mentioned, I don't take any corporate PAC money. My 32-year incumbent opponent is her. You look up her filings, all kinds of corporate money coming into her. She sits on the subcommittee of transportation and oversight. And it's amazing how much transportation, PAC, and corporate money she's taking in to her campaign. And so I'm not suggesting that it's influencing her one way or the other. I'm just pointing out a fact. You understand what I'm saying? And so I'm allowed to contrast myself, and that's what I'm doing here. And that's what I hope to do and to be if the voters vote for me in D.C. on June 21st.
How did you end up working with the Yang campaign?
So what had happened was I was listening to, I was reading the paper. I was reading the New York Times, and I saw an article back in 2018 entitled "The Robots Are Coming." And it was introducing this young man who had just filed to run for the presidency in New York City. And he was talking about universal basic income and how the threat of automation was one of the reasons that had propelled the Trump presidency, because people in the heartland had felt unheard, and they'd lost all these trucking jobs were lost and these customer service jobs. And me originally being from the heartland, Ohio is where I was born. I came to D.C. to go to Howard University.
All the good people are Buckeyes. I see it out there. I see you guys out there. My mother's moving back home like in a week. Back to Cleveland.
Baby. 08.
Yeah.
And so, but I came to D.C. to go to Howard University when I was 17 years old. And I stayed, and I've been here. I went to Howard School of Divinity for seminary. I love this city. So I called D.C. my adult homes, grew me up, so I consider myself a non-native Washingtonian. But yeah, so I read this article about Andrew, right? Talking about this universal basic income. And I started thinking about my grandparents in Ohio who worked at the steel mill, who worked at the shoe factory, and how when those jobs went overseas or when they got automated away, nothing comparable came in to help them. And despair beset my city. I mean, opioid crisis took over, people were just fell into depression and just did not know what to do. And I thought, if I had this universal basic income thing, I think that would have helped, to sustain them until they could find something else. And so I just reached out to the campaign. I said, sir, I don't know who you are, but I like this. I like this policy. You see, I didn't say, oh, he's a Democrat. Oh, he's a Republican. No, I like that policy. And I think I can get behind that. I think I can support what this man is trying to do and to stand for. Wasn't worried about what party he was from. And so I think it was his policies and his vision about humanity first, and it resonated with me, particularly from a ministerial standpoint, looking out for the least of these, and the poor, and the widow, and the oppressed. So I reached out to the campaign via email. He reached back, and about 6 months later, they brought me on staff, and it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. The universal basic income is a big part of my policy platform. I want to bring that to DC as well. So.
Allie, I'm going to come to you in a second and ask you all of these questions, but just to follow up on that, can you just tell the audience just a little bit, a sentence or two about the demographics of your district? And then I want to know how Yang's message resonated with that demographic group, because I don't think that the district, that's a demographic match that people have in their minds in terms of who was supporting Yang. And I want to know more about that.
All right. So, District of Columbia had always been known as the chocolate city. So let's be clear that, Washington, D.C. was, when I arrived back in the 80s, it was 70% Black. It is about 46 now. So we're more of a mocha latte city now, but very strongly rooted in our African-American culture here, and very diverse, just even in terms of demographically, economically, and all that. DC is made up of 8 wards. The 2 wards who are most disadvantaged are east of the river, Ward 7 and 8, over in the Anacostia area. I'm a Ward 8 resident, very proud Ward 8 resident. But when you say, how did Yang's message resonate with the folks in this city, it was based on the universal basic income, because for me, UBI transcended ideology. When I'm coming to you saying we want to take the middleman out, put money into your hands, because even though I'm fighting for statehood, right? Like I said, if you're running in DC, you got to be pro statehood, and so that is my priority message. But if priority message number 1 is statehood, UBI is number 2, because what some people were saying to me was, Reverend Wendy, and this is folks east of the river, Reverend Wendy, I'm for the statehood, I guess, and everything, but how statehood going to put food on my table? How statehood going to put gas in my car? I feel completely disconnected. Y'all have forgotten about us over here. The politicians, they come over here during election time, some of them, and make all these promises. And then even here in DC, they go across the river and we don't see them anymore. You only come over here when you want your vote and stuff like that. And so I have to go up against that narrative and offer something different, something tangible, not just the same old promise that I can get away from, but also letting them know that I will also be putting constituent services offices in all 8 wards so that you will maintain that connection with me while I'm on the Hill. So if I'm not if the UBI checks aren't coming, you can come into the office and you can let me know and hold me accountable for everything that I'm telling you right now that I plan to stand for when I go to the Hill.
Yeah, I don't want to get into a whole conversation about UBI. I know that some listeners have thoughts and feelings about UBI versus universal jobs guarantee and some pros and cons. And
right. Mm-hmm.
And if we just had a conversation recently on the call-in show, if people want to get more into that, but I want to go over to Allie and ask you to paint a picture of what you're up against in your district. Tell us a little bit about your incumbent and what do you think it's going to take to win?
Sure. So in terms of the district, this is a relatively affluent district. It is very much a tale of 2 cities, where we have very home secure, employed, a lot of predominantly white people. The district is about 50% white, 22% Asian, 13% Black, and about 10% Hispanic. But then we also have these pockets of poverty where we have all the people who service these big McMansions and nice homes and whatever. Right here where I live, my next door neighbor is a construction worker, his wife cleans houses, the man across the street is a pharmacist, The other way it's a travel agent. It's sort of these pockets of affluent white neighborhoods and then very diverse working class neighborhoods that dot around. So I had a conversation with someone a little while ago that I'll get to, because I feel like that in a nutshell is kind of the core of the problem. In terms of the differences between me and the incumbent, are that I am running, like Reverend Wendy, a fully grassroots, people-driven campaign, not taking any corporate PAC or dark monies, because I think that perverts the public service aspect of it. I don't think profit should be a motive in any public good, whether that's being a representative or whether it's in the environment, the criminal justice system, healthcare, anywhere. Profit, prison system, it perverts the motive. And if you're going to have a public good, it should be public funded. I believe that. So I support universal healthcare. My opponent does not. I support every American's right to vote, even those who are incarcerated. My opponent did not support Ayanna Pressley's amendment on HR 1. I support taking, obviously with my background, meaningful, substantive, and immediate action to deal with the climate crisis, which is why I'm a Virginia Green New Deal champion. And I don't know if you saw the announcement on Monday that came out with the National Green New Deal champions. I'm one of those. And of course, my opponent signed the Green New Deal resolution, but resolutions don't do anything. They don't bind you to anything. So he got a photo op with AOC in the little hat and has done nothing since, and continues to take money from Dominion and whatever. Which is an oil and gas company.
Because there's people, I mean, again, I don't mean to bring back to this apathy point, but I hope to dispel it by talking a little bit more concretely. Congress being what it is, the distribution of Democrats, much less progressives, being what it is, going into a midterm season where we're expected to not exactly pick up. What do you think? What do you think you can do with the platform of Congress in terms of getting us closer to meaningful climate legislation, climate action?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've spent my literally entire career building bridges and finding common ground to move forward on common purposes. That's literally, everybody's first job influences how they spend their career. And my first job was working at a nonprofit, which was just one of two congressionally created organizations that could commingle public and private funding. So we worked with corporations, states, NGOs, everybody, to find common ground to achieve mutually desirable goals. So, for example, from a natural resources perspective, we're interested in saving the bugs and bunnies, for lack of a better term. And we worked with the paper industry because they were interested in trying to make sure that they had forests, the groves of forest and for those who don't know, paper is a renewable new resource, because you do plant those trees as long as you're not talking about old growth, as well as different corporations who are interested in trying to get some benefits from some of the things they're doing, and the Audubon societies who are interested in the birds that were migrating through those forests, and blah, 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 blah. So the point is, you can find those common grounds. In addition to which, and this, you touched on this earlier about how can I make sure that I'm not going to be bullied? And as Reverend Wendy said, that's a very personal thing. I spent 22 years working in the military, and I can tell you, I have dealt with a lot of very high-ranking officials, and a lot of, these old school men who are in these high-ranking officials who have been there a long time. They don't want to hear from some young female, which is what I started as. But you know what? If you can stand up to a 3-star general when he's telling you that he doesn't want you on his installation, you can pretty much stand up to anybody. And I was able to work with all those people, right? And so going to Congress, there's something you can find to work with everyone. There really is. So, I mean, even like you look at someone like Crowley, who is, he is what he is, but he's really good on rural broadband. So you can find some talk there. With respect specifically to the environment, in the 1970s, corporations were all about, you can't pass the Clean Water Act, you can't pass the Clean Air Act, it's going to cost us so much. And they found that it actually saved them money, all these pollution reduction technologies. And I really think that if we can get with folks like, Manchin with the coal, if you can start finding a way to say, what if we invested in methane recapture technologies? What if we expanded wind in West Virginia? What if we looked at some of these alternative things to get away from, the coal industry? Although, to be honest, I don't know if you know, but I've got the Conflicts of Interest Act that I intend to introduce, which would require that representatives disclose all their sources of funding, including from dark monies and from PACs, and that they recuse themselves from voting on legislation that would impact that industry. And so, whether it would get passed or not, I don't know. But
so one thing I think the idea of, I'm not perfect or candidates aren't perfect has come up a couple of times in the course of this conversation. And I can hear the audience bristling because I think there is sometimes that people on the left, which all of us are, but people on the left are accused of wanting the perfect to be the enemy of the good when we already feel like the bar is pretty low. And also there's a way that, we're characterized as making demands that are so unrealistic and then using those as a litmus test. So I want to put a little bit of finer point on this. I think that one thing that has frustrated folks, even knowing that with a minority in Congress, there's only so much any given progressive can do, is that they aren't even using their platform to highlight the corruption within their own party and, of course, without. So, for example, as friend of the show, Stephen Simler, just tweeted out this stat yesterday. Biden's proposed budget spends 18 times more on the Pentagon than on climate programs. That's $813 billion on military spending versus $44.9 billion on climate spending. This, to me, and the accompanying chart that he's tweeted, is incredibly damning. And yet we all know that there's a political cost to refusing to vote for, much less calling the president out directly in the context of a wartime stance like we're in now for all of this kind of spending. And I think some folks would want to know if you have the temerity to say in a moment like this, Joe Biden, it's unethical to be spending $813 billion on military spending when it's the climate that's going to ultimately end us all. And to advocate in a moment like this, where there's so much public sympathy for what Ukrainian citizens are going through, and say, we need to reserve some sympathy for American citizens at home as well. I mean, what do you make of that kind of a posture, which I think there's a real healthy appetite for, not just on the left, but from a lot of people who are watching shows like Tucker Carlson, where he, for better or for worse, is making some of these kinds of arguments.
Absolutely. I mean, I think people forget that Trump ran as a populist.
Yeah.
He really did. He ran because people were suffering. Now, he did not fulfill those promises.
Well, but he lied.
And yeah, but when he ran as a man of the people. He really did. And I think that absolutely it's ridiculous that we're spending so much in defense spending when the media has done a disservice to the American people by making them think that Russia's army is anywhere near what we've got. The U.S. military is something like bigger than the next 10 countries put together, including Russia and China. And to try and use what's going on as a way to justify increased military contracting so that we can fatten up the bottom line of the military-industrial complex. And the person I'm running again is in the top 10 for taking money from the military-industrial complex. So make no mistake, he votes for that. And I'd like to finish this because it's important.
I just wanted you to name your guys. Both of you have declined to name your
Sorry,
your
I'm running
opponents.
against Gerald Connolly, who he has passed four pieces of legislation in 14 years in office. And he is considered to be this person who is so progressive, calls himself your friend in progressive causes, but he doesn't support Medicare for all. He doesn't support everybody's vote. He doesn't support universal child care. He doesn't support free public college or trade school. He doesn't support every American's right to vote. He absolutely votes for every budget increase in the Pentagon. And he went to Brussels because he's part of the Foreign Relations Committee and said that he wanted to see devastating sanctions against the Russians to crush the economy. And that's just bullshit. I'm sorry, it is. Because Why is it okay to crush to crush the Russian people when that's got nothing to do with what's going on in the oligarchy and is only going to create a situation like we saw in many areas of the world recently, and like we saw after the First World War in Germany. It's an absolutely short-sighted thing. And I would like to point out that it's the politicians who've been in office for the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years that have led us to this situation. And it is absolutely absurd that, for example, we are spending $1.7 trillion right now to modernize our nuclear capability, modernize our nuclear warfare, while student debt is $1.7 trillion. This is why people say poverty is a policy choice. And it's absolutely absurd. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't help. No, student debt is ridiculous. It's absolutely
student debt doesn't
absurd.
have to be paid for. You don't need $1.7 trillion to pay off student debt. It's federally held debt, so it can just be canceled. You don't even need it the way you need it to pay for military spending. Yeah, absolutely.
But the bigger point is, if you're looking at this, what we can do versus what we can't do, it's just a complete shell game. And we're being manipulated. And it comes down to, I mentioned this earlier, and I wasn't going to get into it because it's a whole just rabbit warren. But, media used to be diverse. You used to turn on the news. When I was a kid, you could watch one news station and you get your take on something. You turn to another one, you get a different perspective. And now all you have are talking heads. There are 5 companies that own all the major media. So you basically get the same news, sometimes the same wording on every news media. And, independent media like yourself struggle to try and get news out there. You have to have subscriptions and you have to try and, you're like us, you're grassroots trying to raise your money.
Yeah.
And it's ridiculous. Yeah. And it's just so frustrating to me that the American people are being led into the way that they think, and they don't even realize it. They really genuinely don't. They genuinely think, oh my God, we have got to support Ukraine, and don't realize that we need to look at Syria, Yemen, Palestine, Western Sahara. I mean, the US military is in 140 countries. There are wars happening everywhere. We're just not being told about them. And it's just heartbreaking and crushing. And we've got to, but this is why I'm running. This is why Wendy is running. We need to get people in there who are just going to say, you know what? Enough is enough. I got this. So I get a lot of pushback from the Democratic Party, right? I go to these Zooms and people put things in like, oh my God, I'm so glad I only have to listen to her once, or shut up, get out. Just really like, are we in middle school kind of comments,
what are
right?
these Zooms? What kind of Zooms? Like town halls or?
Like district meetings that are held by the Fairfax County Dems. It's just ridiculous. So I call them the Connolly cronies, because they don't care about listening to another voice. They don't care that they have a misconception. I mean, when I talk to people, they are genuinely surprised that Connolly doesn't support Medicare for all, that he's on record as saying he won't. They think he does because, he comes across as someone who does. And I got this email from this person, and I'd sent out a reminder, blah, 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 please vote for me on June 21. And I got this email reply, and it said, it was from this guy, and he was like, I'm so glad you sent this reminder. I put it in my calendar, to vote for Connolly on June 21. And I was just so freaking frustrated, Briahna, that I replied. I know I shouldn't have, but I did. And I said,
we all have our moments.
Thank you so much for taking the time to respond to this email instead of just hitting the unsubscribe button. Given your comment, I am guessing that you are an affluent white male over the age of 70. If that's the case, Jerry is your guy. I'm here for the rest of us, And that's like my race in a nutshell, right? That's what I face. That's what I'm dealing with. And I'm here because if you're not an affluent white male, you're not being served by the current representative.
Well, Ellie, what's it going to take? What's it going to take to win in your district? I don't know. What is their sense? I don't know if you have polling information. I don't know. Is it that you need enough money for ads to dispel the misapprehension, the faulty belief that Connolly supports Medicare for all and a number of these other progressive programs? Like, what would do it for you? Money for flyers? Money to hire door knockers? Like, what is it?
Yeah, unfortunately, money is key. The bottom line, what I need is just increased visibility. The incumbent's been there. He's got great name recognition. I need greater name recognition. knocking doors is great, but how many doors can I really literally knock when you're talking about a district of 800,000? So yes, I do need money. And I'm hoping folks will donate. I'm hoping folks contribute what they can to all the grassroots candidates and to people who are making a difference, because we're all in this to try and genuinely make a difference.
And
but
this
it's
is Virginia's 11th.
This is Virginia's 11th district, Fairfax County. My website, if you want to check out my issues, is allyforcongress.com, ALLY for Congress, FOR Congress.com. And yeah, absolutely.
Is there going to be a debate?
We've asked, he's declined.
Mm.
So, in fact, he hasn't actually appeared in any place where I have been. He's had last minute conflicts every time. So we'll see. Hopefully our paths will cross at some point. And I really think that if people are aware of what's going on and really understand that their needs are not being served, they'll wake up. Some will, and others will be like those people who still think Trump is on their side and just won't listen to facts and are okay with, Clorox and whatever. I just don't even know. But they're, it's the 70-20-10 rule, right? 70% of the people, you can change their mind if you give them information and they will be aware. 20%, you got to work really hard. 10% never will. So we got to focus on the 70% and just reach those people. Because it's important. Here's the thing, Briahna, and I think Wendy, and I'm dominating, and I'm sorry, and I will let you say whatever you like as well, but I think Wendy would agree and say, what your listeners really need to understand is that we, Wendy and I and the others of us grassroots campaigns, we haven't given up yet. And we get it. People are tired, they're frustrated, they want to give up. But nothing changes if you give up. And it's like the example I mentioned early on. It's darkest before the dawn kind of thing. And
but here's the thing, Allie. I want to help you, but people are going to hear you say they've given up. They haven't given up. They've given up in electoral politics, and they feel dismissed when candidates tell them that if you aren't supporting my candidacy, you are giving up. Because they're not giving up. They're saying, I see what you're asking me to do. I was on board with that train. I tried it. And all the people that I got elected failed me. So that's why I spent the first 30 minutes trying to get people to engage in that particular question. Because folks are not giving up. And I feel like just a word of advice, people feel insulted when they're being told, just because I'm not going to support an electoral strategy, I'm giving up on broad progress. Because the people who are listening to this show are still very engaged.
No, I know that.
Starting to engage differently.
I didn't mean to say that. I meant giving up on electoral politics. That's why I mentioned specifically the candidates. Because, and it's what I said to you before, I think that people are moving more into that activism phase. They're moving more into, let's make a protest, let's do this. And what I say to you is, and I say it a lot, you can eat more salad with a fork than you can a single chopstick. We need a multi-pronged approach. We really, and maybe I'm naive, but I really believe that we have to make change at the local, state, national level. We have to make change in the activism world. We have to make change in the social movement, social justice world, and we have to make change in our electoral system. One avenue is not going to do it. We have to do it across the board, because the fact is you can't legislate. You can try, but you can't really legislate people into being anti-racist, right?
Yeah.
But you also can't pass legislation by doing a march. We have to work together. We have to work collaboratively. We have to communicate. Your forum is awesome because it brings folks together, right? It allows people to have that conversation. And I would say, and I think Wendy would agree, that when you're talking to people, we're trying to bring them on board in whatever way they choose to do it. It's like I said, I would never ask someone who is really struggling to give $7, but I would absolutely ask them, maybe they can pick up the phone and call someone, or maybe they can join a march, or maybe they can sign a petition, or whatever it is. Everybody can do something.
I really want to give you a chance also to tell me what it's going to take to win in your district, and let people hear what your how to contact you, find your campaign information, all of that as well.
Sure. Thank you so much. So I am running against Delegate Eleanor Holms Norton. For those, I hadn't mentioned her name, but she is a 32-year incumbent. She first took the seat in 1990, and she has primarily focused on DC statehood solely as an issue. She has decided that that was going to be her hallmark, and all other issues were sort of pushed to the wayside. So that's my way to win. Let me start there by promoting a candidacy that would represent statehood and beyond, because I don't believe we're a one-dimensional city. I believe we can multitask. So I can work on statehood and universal health care. I can work on statehood and, education reform, and the things that I feel like, are going to bring a tangible difference to the voters. Because as I mentioned to you, as I'm talking to people, they're not seeing any tangible differences happening in their lives. And so they've become disillusioned, they become disconnected. So I think in order to get them reinvested and reconnected, it is going to have to put some proof to the pudding and to what I'm saying. Now, what's going to help me, like Allie, is definitely name recognition, right? Because this is a 32-year incumbent with citywide name recognition. Everybody kind of knows her. But at the same time, what I've also been hearing a lot from the residents is it's time. She's done what she came to do, all due respect or what have you, but it's time for us to start our next chapter. We're ready for our new vision. And so, tapping into that message and getting that out there and letting DC know that they have options. She's only had 3 primary challengers in the entirety of her posts. And so just letting people know that there's an option this year has been, very encouraging. So that's what would help. You can find me at revwendyforcongress.com. That's where you can donate. As Ali said, we are grassroots candidate. I'm not taking any money from corporations. So it is the small dollar donors that are helping me. But we are gaining momentum. I can say we haven't had a debate yet. There's one scheduled April 21st, an in-person one. So we'll see how that goes. But we did have the opportunity this last week to participate in 2 forums with her where she did show up. And that was wonderful to actually finally have that contrast of people being able to hear both of our platforms. And on one of them, it was an endorsement meeting with the DC Latino Caucus. And while she did wind up receiving the endorsement, she cleared it at the lowest level of any of the other candidates. She almost didn't clear the 51% threshold that they wanted. She got like 52, and guess who got the rest? So that shows me that there's some momentum there. That shows me that there's an appetite for something new, because back in the day, those kind of polls for her would have went 73-25. And the last thing I'll say that encourages me, Briahna, about the potential for us being able to win is that unfortunately turnout has been very low, right? So in the 2018 primary, I'm not looking at 2020, that's kind of outlier. A lot of people were voting in 2020. But in 2018, the turnout in the midterm primary for DC was 18%. Out of 493,000 likely voters, only 89,000 people turned out citywide. That is abominable, right? On the one hand, so that I wanted to get to the bottom of those numbers to find out why are people not coming out. We've got high registration, but low turnout. And again, it's because people have become disconnected and disillusioned. So what we figured as a team is, if we can get them excited and engaged again and hopeful again about the possibility of something changing, we can get those turnout numbers up, and then we can win.
Yeah. Well, we will list links to both of your websites in the description of this episode. I do a call-in show the day these posts. So if you want to come back and continue the conversation over on call-in and take some questioners from listeners, I know they would love that. It's an open invitation. I appreciate both of you spending this time with me here today. And to all of our listeners, continue to take care of yourself. And as always, keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.